The great hall of the Galactic Concord stretched for nearly a mile, its crystalline walls reflecting the light of 1,000 holographic displays that showed news from across the stars. And at its center sat Ambassador Jonah Mwangi, a human man of 63 years with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too many arguments and too little gratitude. He had not slept in 2 days. Around him, delegates from 17 different species shouted at each other in languages that ranged from musical whistles to deep rumbling growls, and the translation devices embedded in the walls struggled to keep up with the chaos that filled the chamber like a storm. The hegemony of Reth demands full mining rights to the third moon of Callaway Prime, bellowed the Kreth ambassador, a massive creature that stood 8 feet tall with scales, the color of dried blood, and forearms that had used to pound the table before it. This is not a request, but a statement of intent. Across the chamber, the Callowan delegates trembled in their water-filled tanks, their soft amphibian bodies shaking with fear as they listened to the threats that echoed through the hall. "That moon is sacred to our people," the lead Callowan said through a voice synthesizer that made her words sound mechanical and flat. "Our ancestors are buried there, and our children make pilgrimages to touch the soil where our civilization was born. You cannot take this from us. We can, and we will." The Kreth responded with a laugh that sounded like stones grinding together. "Your ancestors are dead, and dead things have no claim to resources that the living need." Ambassador Mwangi raised his hand, and slowly the chamber fell silent. This was what humans did for 300 years, ever since humanity had first stumbled into the wider galaxy and discovered that they were not alone among the stars. They had taken on the role that no other species wanted. They had become the mediators, the peacemakers, the ones who sat between ancient enemies and found ways to stop them from killing each other. The Valori were too proud for such work. They considered themselves the eldest civilization and believed that younger species should solve their own problems without bothering their betters. The Kreth thought diplomacy was weakness, and that any dispute worth having was worth fighting over the Omnith. Beings of living crystal who thought in pure mathematics, found organic emotions confusing, and preferred to calculate optimal outcomes rather than understand why beings felt the way they did. But humans were different. Humans had spent their entire history fighting each other. They had invented 1,000 ways to kill and 1,000 ways to make peace. They understood hatred and fear and greed because they had lived with these things since they first walked upright on their small blue world. And they understood something else that the other species did not. They understood that everyone wants something, and that behind every demand there is a deeper need that the speaker might not even know they have. "Ambassador Kreth," Mwangi said in a voice that was calm and steady despite his exhaustion, "you say you need the minerals from that moon, but may I ask what you need them for?" The Kreth ambassador snorted with contempt. "That is none of your concern, human." "Perhaps not," Mwangi agreed. "But I know that your empire is building a new fleet of colony ships, and I know that the alloys you need require certain rare elements that are difficult to find. I also know that there are 17 other moons in this sector that contain the same elements in even greater quantities." The chamber went quiet. "You did not know this," Mwangi continued, "because your survey teams only scanned the Callowan system. But my people have been mapping this region for decades, and we have data that could save you years of searching and billions in resources." He turned to the Callowan. "And you, my friends, I know that your sacred moon is also the only source of a particular fungus that your healers used to treat a disease that kills thousands of your children every year. A disease that you have kept secret because you feared other species would see it as weakness." The Callowan ambassador's eyes went wide. "How do you know this?" "Because we pay attention," Mwangi said simply. And because we care enough to learn, he stood and walked to the center of the chamber, his old bones aching but his mind sharp and clear. "Here is what I propose," he said. "The hegemony of Reth will receive full coordinates to 12 moons with mineral deposits that exceed what they sought on Caloan Prime. In exchange, they will formally recognize Caloan sacred sites as protected territory under Galactic Concord law. Furthermore, humanity will share our medical research on fungal treatments with the Caloan, which may help them synthesize the compounds they need without relying on a single source." He looked around the room. "Everyone gets what they actually need, and no one has to die. Does this seem acceptable?" For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the Kreth ambassador laughed again, but this time there was something almost like respect in the sound. "You humans are strange creatures. You work so hard to solve problems that are not your own. Someone has to," Manji replied. The vote was taken, and the agreement passed. Later that night, Manji sat alone in his quarters, staring out at the stars through a window that stretched from floor to ceiling. His assistant, a young woman named Yuki Tanaka, brought him a cup of tea and sat beside him. "Another crisis resolved," she said. "You should be proud." "Should I?" Manji asked with a sad smile. "Did you see how they looked at us, Yuki? Even when we help them, they resent us for it. They think we meddle because we want power, not because we want peace." "Does it matter what they think?" Yuki asked. "We saved lives today. That moon is safe, and those Caloan children will get the medicine they need." "It matters," Manji said quietly, "because one day they will grow tired of us. One day they will decide that our help is interference and our compassion is arrogance. And on that day, they will push us out and tell themselves that they never needed us at all." Yuki shook her head. "That will never happen. They need us too much." Manji did not answer. He simply stared at the stars and wondered how long humanity could carry a galaxy that did not want to be carried outside the window. Ships from 100 different worlds moved through the darkness, their crews unaware of the old man who had just saved them from another war. Unaware and uncaring, that was the burden humanity bore. That was the thankless duty they had chosen, and somewhere in the back of Jonah Mwangi's tired mind, a small voice whispered that it could not last forever. The distress signal came from a world called Vareth the Seventh, a small green planet at the edge of explored space where a civilization of peaceful, insect-like beings had just discovered fire and built their first villages. They did not know that ships from distant stars watched them from orbit. They did not know that their entire species had been marked for Death Commander Yuki Tanaka, now 45 years old and captain of the human peacekeeping vessel Horizon, received the signal on a quiet morning while her ship patrolled the neutral zones between empires. "Commander," a communications officer said with a trembling voice, "you need to see this." The footage that played on the main screen made Tanaka's blood run cold. Krith warships hung in the sky above, Vareth 7 like metal thunderclouds, and from their bellies fell pods that crashed into forests and fields and villages. Inside those pods were soldiers with weapons that could turn a living creature to ash with a single shot. And those soldiers had begun their work with terrible efficiency. The insect beings ran and screamed in languages that no translator could understand, but the meaning was clear in every culture across every star. They were begging for their lives. "Why?" Tanaka whispered. "Why are the Kreth doing this?" Her science officer pulled up the data. "The planet has deposits of a rare crystal that the Kreth use in their jump drives. Their surveys indicate that the native population would need to be removed before mining could begin." Removed. Tanaka repeated the word like it was poison in her mouth. "They are not removing them. They are murdering them. The Galactic Concord has no jurisdiction here," her first officer said quietly. "Vareth 7 is in unclaimed space, and the natives have no voice in the council. Technically, the Kreth are within their rights." Tanaka stood from her captain's chair. And her eyes burned with a fury that her crew had never seen before. "Rights," she said. "What right allows you to kill children who do not even know the stars exist? What law says that innocence is a crime punishable by extinction?" She turned to her navigation officer. "Set a course for Vareth 7. Maximum speed." "Commander," her first officer said carefully, "if we intervene, we will be acting against the will of the Council. There could be consequences. Then there will be consequences," Tanaka replied. "But I did not join this fleet to watch genocide from a safe distance. We are going, and anyone who disagrees can note their objection in the log." No one objected. The Horizon arrived at Vareth 7 6 hours later. And what Tanaka saw made her heart break. The forests were burning, and the rivers ran red with blood. Villages that had stood for generations were nothing but smoke and ash. And in the fields, the bodies of the insect beings lay scattered like fallen leaves after a storm, but not all of them were dead. In the northern continent, a group of survivors had gathered in a valley, surrounded on all sides by Kreth soldiers who waited for the order to finish their work. Tanaka opened a channel to the Kreth fleet. "Commander, this is Commander Yuki Tanaka of the Human Peacekeeping Force," she said. "I am ordering you to cease all hostile operations immediately." The Kreth commander appeared on screen, his scaled face twisted with amusement. "You have no authority here, human. This is Kreth business, and your interference is not welcome." "I am not asking for permission," Tanaka replied. "I am telling you to stop, and if we do not—" Tanaka looked at the screen, and her voice became something cold and hard and absolutely certain. "Then you will have to go through me." She cut the channel and turned to her crew. "Take us down. Put the Horizon between the Kreth ground forces and those survivors." "Commander," her weapons officer said, "they have 17 warships. We have 1. I know. If they attack, we cannot win." "I know that too," Tanaka said. "But they will have to choose. They can have their crystals, or they can have a war with humanity. Let us see which they want more." The Horizon descended through the burning atmosphere and settled into position above the valley, its shields glowing bright against the smoke-filled sky. And there it stayed for 6 days. The Kreth fleet surrounded them. For 6 days, weapons were locked and threats were made. For 6 days, Tanaka and her crew waited for the shot that would end their lives. But the shot never came. The Kreth were bullies, but they were not fools. They knew that attacking a human ship would bring the full weight of Earth's fleet down upon them. They knew that the crystals, precious as they were, could be found elsewhere. And they knew that the woman who stared at them from that single ship would not move, would not yield, would not break no matter what they died in the 7th day. The Kreth fleet withdrew. Tanaka collapsed in her chair as the enemy ships jumped to hyperspace. And for the first time in a week, she allowed herself to breathe. They had saved 37,000 lives, but the Council did not see it that way 2 weeks later. Ambassador Jonah Mwangi stood before the full assembly of the Galactic Concord, listening to charges being read against humanity with a face carved from stone. "Unilateral military action," the Valori delegate announced. "Interference in sovereign species affairs. Violation of the Non-Intervention Compact. Conduct unbecoming of a council member." The vote was called, and one by one, the species that humanity had served for 3 centuries raised their voices. Against Earth, the Valori voted for censure. The Omnith voted for sanctions. Even the Caloan, whose sacred moon Mwangi had saved just years ago, voted to punish the species that had defended the defenseless. Only humanity voted against the 11-1. Mwangi listened to the verdict, and something inside him that had held together for decades finally cracked. He walked to the podium and placed his hands on the cold metal surface. And when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of that great hall. 300 years, he said. For 300 years, humanity has sat in this chamber and done the work that none of you wanted to do. We have negotiated your treaties and resolved your disputes and buried our dead on worlds whose names you cannot pronounce. We have given everything, and we have asked for nothing but the chance to help. He looked around the room at the delegates who would not meet his eyes. And now, because one of our officers refused to watch children be murdered, you stand in judgment of us. You call our compassion a crime and our courage a violation. He reached into his coat and pulled out his credentials. The golden disc that marked him as humanity's voice in the Galactic Concord. I have spent my entire life believing that this council stood for something, Manji said. I was wrong. He placed the disc on the podium. Humanity resigns from the Galactic Concord. Effective immediately, all human peacekeepers will be recalled. All human diplomats will return to Earth. And all human aid programs will be terminated. The chamber erupted in shocked whispers. You cannot do this. The Valori delegate stammered. The galaxy needs human mediation, Manji smiled. And there was no warmth in it. Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you made criminals of our heroes. He turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Wait, someone called. What will happen without you? Manji paused at the door and looked back one final time. I suppose you will find out. And then he was gone, and humanity was gone. And the galaxy that had taken them for granted was finally terribly alone. The first year after humanity's departure was a celebration that lasted across 100 worlds. The Valori hosted grand feasts in their crystal palaces, raising glasses of ancient wines to toast the end of what they called human meddling in galactic affairs. They laughed about how the young species had finally learned its place and predicted that Earth would come crawling back within a year. Begging for forgiveness, the Omnith, beings of living crystal who thought in numbers and probabilities, calculated that the galaxy would run more efficiently without human emotional interference. Their projections showed a 12% increase in what they called sovereign optimization, now that species could resolve their own disputes without outside involvement even. The smaller civilizations joined in the relief. For too long, they whispered. The humans had made them feel inadequate. For too long, the humans had swooped in to solve problems and made everyone else look weak by comparison. Now, finally, the galaxy could stand on its own Earth. The humans watched these celebrations on their news screens with expressions that mixed sadness and bitter amusement. They think we were holding them back, said Commander Yuki Tanaka, who'd been quietly retired after her actions at Vera 7. They actually believe they will be better off without us. Let them believe it, said Ambassador Mwanji, who had returned to his home in East Africa to spend his remaining years with his family. We cannot force wisdom on those who refuse to learn. His daughter Amara, a young diplomat who had followed in her father's footsteps, sat beside him on the porch of his small house, watching the sun set over the savannah. Do you think they will ever understand? She asked. Do you think they will ever realize what we did for them? Manji took a long time to answer. They will understand, he said finally. But understanding will come with a terrible price. And by the time they pay it, many innocent lives will be lost. He was right. The first cracks appeared in the 6th month. A trade dispute between the Selthari Federation and the merchant guilds of Un had been simmering for decades. But human diplomats had always managed to keep it from boiling over. Every time tensions rose, a human mediator would arrive with compromise proposals and patient negotiations that found common ground. Now there was no one to mediate. Selthari accused the guilds of price manipulation. The guilds accused the Selthari of unfair tariffs. And without a neutral party to translate their grievances into solutions, the accusations grew louder and angrier with each passing week by the 8th month. The Scifistories had blockaded 3 major trade routes by the 10th month. A guild convoy tried to break through and was fired upon by the end of the first year. 3 orbital stations had been destroyed, and 2,000 beings were dead. The council met to address the crisis, but the session descended into chaos within minutes. The Valari demanded that the Scifistories back down. The Kreth sided with whoever offered them better mining contracts. The Omnith proposed mathematical solutions that ignored the emotional realities driving the conflict. And no one could agree on anything because no one understood how to actually talk to each other. They had forgotten, or perhaps they had never learned, that peace was not a natural state. Peace was something that had to be built and maintained and fought for every single day. And humanity had been doing that work so quietly and so constantly that everyone had assumed it simply happened on its own. The Kreth were next to take advantage, with no human peacekeepers to challenge them. They resumed their expansion with a hunger that shocked even their allies. System after system fell under their control as they claimed resources and territory that had been protected by human negotiated treaties. Those agreements were made under human pressure, the Kreth ambassador announced to the council. Without human enforcement, they are meaningless. The Calawan begged for help as Kreth ships appeared at the edge of their sacred space, but the council could only offer stern words and empty resolutions. Without humanity's willingness to stand between the weak and the strong, words were all they had in the telepathic homeworld of the Yuvani. The elders gathered in their meditation chambers and wept. "We can hear them," the eldest Yuvani said to the council through a communication link, her ancient face streaked with tears. "Across the galaxy, we can hear the minds of the dying. They scream in fear and pain, and their screams grow louder every day. What would you have us do?" The Valori delegate asked with irritation. "Bring back the humans," the Yuvani replied. They were the only ones who could make the screaming stop, but the council refused. Their pride would not allow them to admit that they had made a mistake. Their arrogance would not let them acknowledge that the species they had dismissed as meddlers had actually been the foundation upon which galactic peace was built. So the screaming continued, and the dying continued, and the galaxy that had celebrated humanity's departure began to wonder if they had made a terrible error on Earth. The humans watched it all happen. They watched the trade wars and the border conflicts and the slow collapse of agreements that had taken centuries to build. They watched civilizations they had once protected fall into chaos and despair. They watched the stars grow darker as hope faded across 1,000 worlds, and they did nothing. "We should help them," Amara said to her father as news of another massacre reached Earth. "We cannot just watch them destroy themselves." Manji shook his head slowly. "They do not want our help. They made that very clear when they punished Tanaka for saving lives. If we go back now, they will only resent us more. So we just let them suffer." "No," Manji said. "We let them learn. We let them understand that peace is not free and that someone must be willing to fight for it. And when they finally understand, when they come to us and ask for help because they truly want it and not because they want someone to do their dirty work, then we will be there." "And how many will die before they learn that lesson?" Amara asked. Her father looked at her with eyes that held more sorrow than she had ever seen. "Too many," he said. "Far too many. But we cannot force people to value what they are not willing to lose. They must choose peace themselves, or it will never last." So humanity waited, and the galaxy burned, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, the screaming of the dying grew louder and louder, echoing across the void like a prayer that no one was willing to answer. The Yuvani elders closed their minds to the galaxy and retreated into silence. Unable to bear the weight of so much suffering, the Calawan sent message after message to Earth, begging for the return of the protectors who had once saved their sacred moon. Even some of the Kreth began to wonder if conquest was worth the price they were paying in. blood and treasure, but still the council refused to act, and still humanity refused to return, and the galaxy that had laughed at their departure now whispered their name in the dark like a memory of better days, wondering if they would ever see human ships in their skies again. 5 years had passed since humanity walked out of the Galactic Concord, and in that time, the galaxy had become a place of nightmares. The great hall where Ambassador Wanji had once brokered peace now stood half empty, its crystalline walls cracked and stained with the smoke of 1,000 distant fires. The delegates who still bothered to attend sat in clusters divided by fear and suspicion. And the translation devices had been broken for months because no one could agree on who should pay for repairs. The Galactic Concord existed in name only. The Kreth Dominion had swallowed 47 star systems, and their war fleets prowled the shipping lanes like hungry predators looking for their next meal. Planets that had once been free now labored under the iron grip of Kreth overseers who cared nothing for the lives. They ruled the Seltharian trade war had spread like a cancer, drawing in a dozen other civilizations until half the galaxy was choosing sides in a conflict that had started over tariffs and had become something much darker and more personal. The original dispute was forgotten, but the hatred remained. The Valori had sealed their borders and retreated behind ancient defense networks that their ancestors had built millennia ago. They told themselves that they were preserving their culture from the chaos outside, but everyone knew the truth. They were hiding because they were afraid warlords had risen in the lawless spaces between empires. Petty tyrants who built their thrones on piles of corpses and called themselves kings. Piracy had become an industry, and refugee fleets wandered from star to star, rejected by every port because no one had resources to spare for the desperate. The Omnith, who had once calculated that the galaxy would run better without humanity, ran their numbers again and reached a terrifying conclusion. Galactic civilization had a 34% chance of total collapse within 20 years. How did this happen? The youngest Omnith delegate asked the eldest during one of their rare communication sessions. Our projections showed improvement, not catastrophe. The eldest Omnith paused for a long time before responding. We calculated efficiency, they said. We measured resource allocation and conflict resolution rates and diplomatic output. But we failed to account for a variable that we did not understand. What variable? The humans called it hope on a dozen worlds. Species that had never thought much about humanity began to remember. A Kauan historian named Veth spent years digging through old records, searching for data on every conflict that humanity had resolved during their 3 centuries of service. What she found shocked her. There had been 217 major disputes that could have become wars, and human diplomats had diffused every single one. There had been 43 attempted genocides, and human peacekeepers had prevented them all. There had been countless small crises, border incidents and trade disputes and cultural misunderstandings that could have spiraled into violence. And behind every peaceful resolution was a human who had stayed up late and worked hard and cared enough to find another way. We never saw them, Veth said in a public broadcast that reached across the remaining communication networks. They worked in the shadows, solving problems before we even knew they existed. And we called them meddlers because we were too blind to see that they were saving us. A Selthari journalist named Kron published a report that listed the death tolls from every conflict that had erupted since humanity left. The numbers were so large that many readers could not comprehend them. Billions dead, trillions displaced, entire civilizations reduced to refugees and memories. This is the price of our pride, Kron wrote. This is what it costs to be free of human interference. Even the Kreth began to question their conquest, Admiral Thrak, the commander who had led the expansion that swallowed 47 worlds. sat alone in his quarters, staring at reports of uprisings and resistance movements that seemed to multiply faster than his soldiers could crush them. "We won," he said to his second-in-command. "Why does victory feel so much like defeat?" "Because we have no one to trade with," his second replied. "Because our supply lines are stretched thin and our soldiers are exhausted and the species. We conquered Haya so deeply that they would rather die than submit. We have built an empire on sand, Admiral, and it is already beginning to crumble." Track remembered the day that Commander Tanaka had stood her ship between his fleet and the survivors of Varus 7. He remembered how she had stared at him through the view screen with eyes that held no fear, only certainty. And he remembered that he had backed down because some part of him, some small and buried part, had known that she was right. "The humans would have stopped us," he said quietly. "If they had stayed, they would have found a way to give us what we needed without all this blood." "Yes," his second agreed. "They would have. Then why did we celebrate when they left?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable on Earth. Jonah Mwangi had died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his family and his memories. His daughter Amara had taken up his legacy. Though she had no official title and no formal power, she spent her days reading reports from across the galaxy, tracking the collapse that her father had predicted. And every day, she asked herself the same question that had haunted him. When would they learn? When would they finally understand? The answer came on a quiet morning when a single ship appeared at the edge of Earth's solar system and broadcast a message on all frequencies. "This is a delegation from the remaining members of the Galactic Concord," the message said. "We carry no weapons and seek no conflict. We come only to speak." Amara watched the ship approach through the window of her office, and she felt something shift in her chest. A mix of hope and anger and grief that she could not quite name. "Let them land," she said to her staff. "Let us hear what they have to say." The delegation consisted of 12 species, including some that had voted to censure humanity 5 years ago. They walked into the meeting room with their heads bowed and their eyes filled with shame. And when they saw Amara sitting at the head of the table, they stopped. "You look like him," the Caloan delegate said softly. "You look like Ambassador Manji." "He was my father," Amara replied. "He died believing that one day you would understand." "I am here to see if he was right," the Valori delegate, an ancient being who had lived for thousands of years and had seen civilizations rise and fall, stepped forward. "We were wrong," they said, and the words seemed to cost them something precious. "We were wrong about everything. We thought we did not need you, and we were fools. We thought peace would maintain itself, and we were blind. We thought your compassion was weakness, and we were arrogant beyond measure." They knelt before Amara, a gesture that the Valori had not made to any other species in 10,000 years. "We are asking you to come back. We are begging you. Please, the galaxy is dying, and we do not know how to save it." Amara looked at them for a long moment, and in her eyes was the same fire that had burned in her father's eyes and in Commander Tanaka's eyes and in the eyes of every human who had ever stood between the innocent and the darkness. "You do not want peace," she said quietly. "You want us to want it for you. And that is not the same thing." The delegation fell silent, and the weight of her words settled over them like a judgment from which there was no appeal. But Amara was not finished. However, she continued, and something in her voice made them look up with desperate hope. "I am willing to listen. Tell me what you are prepared to offer. Tell me what you are willing to sacrifice. And then we will see if humanity still has a place in your stars." The galaxy held its breath, and for the first time in 5 years, something that might have been hope flickered in the darkness between the worlds. The delegation remained on Earth for 37 days, and in that time, they learned things about humanity that they had never understood before. They walked through human cities and saw species from across the galaxy living side by side in peace. Refugees who had fled the chaos and found shelter on the very world that the Council had condemned. They visited human schools where children learned the histories of 100 different civilizations and were taught to see the value in every form of life. They spoke with human veterans who had served on distant worlds and bore scars from battles fought to protect strangers who would never know their names. "How do you do this?" the Omnith delegate asked Amara during one of their conversations. "How do you care so much about beings you have never met?" Amara smiled at the question, a sad and knowing smile that reminded everyone of her father. "We do not know how not to," she said. "It is not something we learned or chose. It is simply who we are. When we see suffering, we feel it in our own hearts. When we see injustice, something inside us refuses to look away. You call it meddling, but we call it empathy. And we cannot turn it off any more than you can turn off your need to breathe." The Omnith processed this information for a long time before speaking again. "We calculated that your emotional involvement was inefficient," they admitted. "We believed that detachment would lead to better outcomes. We were wrong in ways that our mathematics cannot explain." "Mathematics cannot measure what a life is worth," Amara replied. "That requires something else entirely." When the 37 days were complete, Amara called the delegation together in the same room where they had first met and presented her terms. "Humanity will return to the Galactic Concord," she said, "but not as mediators, not as peacekeepers, and certainly not as servants who do your difficult work while you take the credit and cast blame when things go wrong." She activated a holographic display that filled the room with light. "We will return as equals. Full voting rights on all council matters. Veto power on any decision that involves the use of military force. And a permanent seat on the Security Council that should have been ours from the very beginning." The delegates exchanged nervous glances. These were enormous concessions, changes that would reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. "There is more," Amara continued. "You will formally acknowledge that Commander Yuki Tanaka acted with honor at Varith 7. You will strike her censure from the record. And you will name a peacekeeping doctrine after her, one that recognizes the right of intervention to prevent genocide regardless of where it occurs." The Kreth delegate shifted uncomfortably. This was dangerously close to an admission that his species had committed crimes against innocent people. And finally, Amara said, and her voice grew hard as steel, "You will help us." She pulled up a new display, a list of worlds and species and civilizations. "These are the peoples who are currently under threat of extinction. Some are being conquered. Some are being starved. Some are dying from diseases that your advanced science could cure in a day if anyone bothered to try." She looked around the room at the delegates who represented the oldest and most powerful civilizations in known space. "You will commit resources to save every single one of them. Not because it is efficient, not because it benefits you, but because it is the right thing to do. And if you are not willing to do what is right, then we have nothing more to discuss." Silence filled the room. The Caloan delegate spoke first, their voice trembling with emotion. "We accept. Our people owe humanity a debt that we can never fully repay. Whatever you ask, we will give." The Southari delegate nodded slowly. "The Federation has spent too long fighting over scraps. It is time we built something instead of destroying." "We accept." One by one, the delegations agreed. Even the Kreth, after a long and painful pause, lowered their massive heads in acceptance. Only the Valori remained silent. The ancient being who had knelt before Amara days ago now rose to their full height. And for a moment, it seemed that they might refuse. For a moment, it seemed that their 10,000-year-old pride might be stronger than their need for help. But then they looked at Amara, at this young human woman who had the courage to demand from the oldest Civilization in the galaxy, what no one had ever dared demand before. And something in their ancient eyes changed. My people believed ourselves to be the guardians of galactic civilization, the Valori said slowly. We believed that our age and our wisdom gave us the right to guide lesser species toward enlightenment. But we were not guardians. We were caretakers who refused to care. We were elders who had forgotten how to listen. They extended one long, slender hand toward Amara. Humanity has shown us what true guardianship means. It means sacrifice without expectation of reward. It means standing firm when others would flee. It means loving those who do not love you back. Their voice broke slightly, an expression of emotion that no Valori had shown in public for millennia. We accept your terms, Ambassador Mwanji. All of them. And we will spend whatever remains of our existence trying to be worthy of the second chance you have given us. Amara took the offered hand and felt the weight of history settle around her shoulders. The same weight that her father had carried. The same burden that Commander Tanaka had borne. The same responsibility that humanity had accepted 300 years ago when they first stepped into the stars and saw a galaxy that needed them. Then let us begin, she said. The return of humanity to the Galactic Concord was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. Treaties were rewritten. Borders were redrawn. The Kreth Dominion was forced to release their conquered worlds and face justice for the crimes they had committed. Warlords who had built empires on suffering were hunted down and brought before tribunals where human judges sat alongside representatives of every species they had wronged. It was not easy, and it was not quick, and many times it seemed that the whole fragile structure of peace might collapse under the weight of old hatreds and new fears. But humanity held the center in every disputed region. Human diplomats worked tirelessly to find common ground. In every crisis zone, human peacekeepers stood watch against those who would prey on the vulnerable. In every chamber where the powerful gathered to decide the fate of the weak, human voices spoke for those who could not speak for themselves. 50 years passed, and the galaxy changed. Volmneth developed new equations that accounted for what they called the empathy variable, and their predictions became far more accurate. The Calawan built great monuments on their sacred moon to honor the humans who had saved them. And every year they held festivals where children learned the stories of Mwanji and Tanaka and all the others who had given so much for so long. Even the Kreth, humbled by defeat and taught by time, began to understand. A new generation rose that saw strength, not in conquest but in cooperation, and slowly, painfully, they became something better than they had been on the anniversary of humanity's return. A Kreth ambassador named Vrax approached a human colleague during a diplomatic reception. Vrax was old now, one of the last survivors of the generation that had fought for expansion, and his scales had faded to a dull gray. "May I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Something I have wondered about for many years." The human, a young diplomat named Chen, who had never known a galaxy without human leadership, nodded. "Of course. Why do you bother?" Vrax asked. "After everything we did, after how we treated you, why do you still fight for us? Why do you still care about species that once called you meddlers and demanded that you leave?" Chen smiled. And in that smile was something ancient and young at the same time. Something that had been passed down through generations of humans who had looked at the stars and seen not danger or resources, but neighbors in need of help, because someone has to give a damn, Chen replied. And we have gotten pretty good at it. Vrax had no response. He simply stood there, watching the young human walk away. And in his old warrior's heart, something that had been frozen for decades finally began to thaw across the galaxy. The stars burned on, as they always had and always would. But for the first time in a very long time, they seemed to burn a little brighter, a little warmer, a little more like home in her office on Earth. Amara Mwanji, now elderly herself, looked out at those same stars and remembered her father's words from so many years ago. "They will understand," he had said. But understanding will come with a terrible price. He had been right, as he always was, but he had also been right about something else. Something he had believed with all his heart, even in his darkest moments. Peace was possible. Peace was worth fighting for. And as long as there were humans willing to stand in the gap between hatred and hope, peace would endure somewhere among those distant stars. A child of a species that had nearly been destroyed looked up at the night sky and saw a human ship passing overhead, its lights blinking like a promise. The child did not know the history. They did not know about the Concord or the exile or the long dark years when the galaxy had learned the cost of its arrogance. They only knew that when they saw those lights, they felt safe. And that was enough. That was everything.